This is an interview with Paul and Helen Zurbriggen for the Valley Historical Project, and I'm doing the interviewing, Harriet Blockus, and I'm assisted by my husband, Ken Blockus, and the date is January 21st, 1999, and we're doing the taping at the Paul and Helen Zurbriggen home. We want to thank Paul and Helen for this interview. The material we gather today will be used to preserve the heritage of our region. It will be used for educational purposes, but it might also be used in promoting economic development and tourism in Northeast Iowa. And we're going to start out with Paul giving us some basic information about who he is and where he was born and about his parents and any immigration they did to the United States. Paul?
Paul Bramwell Zurbriggen was born in December 13th, 1915, 3 miles northwest of Claremont on a small farm. My parents were both born in Switzerland and migrated to this country in 1911. They arrived in the spring of the year and were brought by wagon to the John Rowland farm and stayed with them for approximately 3 years as hired indentured servants. My father continued to farm and moved to a small farm right near Claremont, and then from there he moved to the Corn Hill farm, which was located 5 miles from Fayette, 5 miles from Wadena, and 5 miles from Fayette.
You said Fayette twice.
And there I began my school years.
Okay, and now you mentioned Corn Hill Farm. Is that name that old? Didn't they name that Corn Hill now? Isn't that
Corn Hill Road.
Yeah, is that the one going out of Wadena?
That is 5 miles out. The occupants now are Representative
Oh, Hurley.
Hurley.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, all right. Because I've seen that on signs, and I thought, oh, they made that name up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Your mother loved that place.
That was a beautiful place.
Okay.
And then we moved from there to the farm located between Claremont and Elgin. We called it the Probert Farm. The first farm after you cross the bridge going to Claremont on the left side of that, on the right side of the
The
road.
right side, where they have the pond in the back.
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Gravel pits were in back there.
And I have been there ice skating. Okay, I know where that is. All right, is there anything else, or do you want to change over to Helen now? Okay, Helen.
Well, I was born across the street in my parents' home. And that was my birth home, and my brothers were 9 years older than I was, and since they were twins, they sort of got all the publicity. But I was always knew that I was loved and really wanted. But people would come into the furniture store and say, "Oh, I didn't know you had a daughter," but that was okay.
That made you special.
My grandparents both were immigrants. On my maternal side, my grandpa Bauman, Jacob Bauman, and came to Elgin, and his first thought was to start a church, and so he was one of the founders of the Baptist Church. My father was born down near the big springs near Elkader. And he always would tell stories to our children about how the reason he didn't have any hair was because the Indians had scalped him.
Bob believed that till he was of school age.
He did. And then my grandfather, Freiberghaus, was brought here as one of 7 children. And his father was the one that started the furniture store. And in those days, it was common for a cabinet maker to make the coffins. And so that's how they became morticians. The 2 businesses went together. We've been told that his wife would paint the flowers on the caskets in Switzerland. And she was quite artistic. She died before the family could come, but he still came with his big family. And the first furniture store was located where the Grimm house is now. And then my grandfather built the furniture store where the Leonard laundromat is presently located.
There were 2 additions or 3 to that store.
And my mother's family was large, and they lived above the furniture store. That was where her home was.
Okay, is there anything else that you want to add, or should we move on to the education part? Okay, if we take turns, that helps. Paul, do you want to go on and tell us a little bit about your education, like for elementary, high school, college?
Okay.
And then you can go, then Helen, you switch over and do your education, and then we'll move on to marriage.
I received my first 6 years of elementary education in the rural schools. And my parents moved to Elgin in 1926, and I finished my elementary in Elgin and also graduated from high school here. And then I went on to Upper Iowa University, and the first year was rather difficult. My family was quarantined for scarlet fever, and I came home and did the baking for my dad. And then I stayed out a year and 1 semester and went back to Upper Iowa. And here I finished my education in spring of 1938. And I received most of my tuition, and I worked for my room and board. And
I think you owed $200 when you finished.
And also for some of my spending money at a cafe in Fayette. I received a scholarship to play football, and then I also participated in baseball. And it was really a fun time. I played on the undefeated, untied football team at Upper Iowa, which was the first one in the fall of 1937. And I also played was a member of the squad in baseball that won 2 conference championships.
Who was your coach at that?
Dr. John Dorman was the coach, and we not only had him as a coach, but as a man who did a lot for each individual. He would let us bring our problems to him. He would even fix our teeth.
He was a dentist.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then I was made principal my second year on the condition I get my principal certificate that summer. So I was teaching for my former coach and superintendent
Now, where was this?
at Kanawha, Iowa. And the first year, I received $900 for the year. And if I would be principal the second year, I would get a $10 raise a month. And so I continued there for.
Well, you went to Colorado to get your principal's certificate that summer.
Right, Boulder, Colorado. And then he left and went to Garner, and I was asked to apply for the job of coach and teacher at Garner. And I moved to Garner in 1942. I was there just 1 year, and I was drafted into the military.
Why don't we switch over to Helen then? Right, and you tell a little bit about your early education and profession.
Well, I always loved to go to school. And when I was 4 years old, I used to run away, and Mother would know where to find me. It was at school. And the teacher then was Irene Nello Keipel, and she would say, "Oh, she's no problem, just let her stay." So I actually went 1 year as a 4-year-old because I knew how to read, but my parents were wise and didn't let me skip a grade. I went back as a first grader and loved every minute of it. And I had my whole education at the Elgin Elementary and Elgin High School. So by that time, Paul and I had started going together. So I went over to Upper Iowa as a freshman when Paul was a senior. And I felt like I really had it made because he was president of his class and he was a football player and was very well known on campus. So that was a really fun year. He even found time from his busy schedule to come up and see me at the Burns house. And we didn't have living room privileges, so there were 4 of us that lived upstairs, had 2 apartments. They were fairly nice apartments, but we had to use the stair steps, so there were 2, 4, 6, 8 sitting on the stair steps when our boyfriends would come to see us. And I remember that Paul's sweater reeked so of hamburgers because it's basically what he did, that we'd have to hang his sweater out on the porch while he was there. And
She'll tell
so
it all.
I only went 2 years because in those days that was about all my parents could afford. So then I finished my BA later.
And you didn't have to have 4 years to be able to teach.
To teach. Should I tell about my first job? Or I remember most teachers at that time, or most students, were going out and having to take a job with teaching 2 grades. But I applied at Shell Rock and I got a job teaching just 1 grade, 3rd grade. And that was the happiest day of my life, one of the happiest. I remember having to go see all the board members, climbing over fences and interviewing with each one. And it was just really special when I was hired.
And you got $735 that year.
That's right.
It's good to hear those amounts because that helps us see how the changes have come about.
And really, we didn't feel that poor at that time. I remember buying a 3-piece suit with the coat had a raccoon collar, and thought it was pretty nice.
Would you like to tell about your getting married?
Actually, we had been going together about 4 years, but along came World War II, and Paul was going to be drafted.
I might add a note to that I was teaching a history class at Kanawha. And just for fun, I thought I'd take the radio in and let the students listen to the drawing of numbers from the lottery there. And my name was one of the first ones drawn that day.
When you speak about the lottery, would you explain what that lottery was? The draft?
Well, maybe that isn't the right name, but they were drawing numbers to find out who would make up the first draftees. And that continued for a long time.
And you each had a number.
Each had a number.
I just wanted to be sure that the younger people didn't think that that was for money.
So when we knew that his drafting was imminent, the only time we really had to get married, he was supposed to go in June, was over Easter, the Easter vacation. We had Good Friday, Thursday. I think we took Thursday off, and then we had Good Friday and Saturday and Sunday. So we were married in my home on Good Friday, and my mother decorated the living room with Easter lilies. And we took a trip. Our honeymoon was to Minneapolis to the Curtis Hotel, and we borrowed a car from his brother-in-law, Bill Weibel, because we thought that was better than our car. And on the way home, it broke down between Harmony and
Preston?
Preston. And there we were stranded until a patrolman came along and pushed us down the big hill into Preston. We sat there all Sunday afternoon getting the car repaired, and both had to be back to teach the next morning and in Kanawha and Shell Rock on Monday morning. So it was quite an eventful honeymoon.
Since your marriage goes right into military service, that's kind of a little bit out of order of this, but why don't we just go right into telling about your military service, and then we'll go back to childhood.
Could I add a note to the
Sure.
fact that I went to Des Moines to Camp Dodge, and I had received a football injury that I was not aware of, and I was deferred and put in as a 4F. So I came back to Kanawha, and
Then we went to Garner.
did we have our home in? No, we weren't living together.
No.
Then at Garner we established our first home in 1942.
That just lasted 1 year, and then he was back in the Army again.
How did they get you in the Army if you were 4F?
They weren't very particular anymore at that point.
They were in need of personnel, and I was called again for examination, and this time I was warm and they took me.
And what year was that?
I was in 1943.
43. Okay. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your military experience?
You were trained and
I was sent to California to Camp Roberts. That was the largest infantry training base in the USA, and I knew then where I was headed. It was called a replacement. There were 80,000 of us training there at the time, and we would go back to units that were already in combat as replacements. Fortunately, since I had a Swiss-German background, at the end of my basic training, they sent me to Chicago University, where I was to study German language, and we were going to be used as intelligence personnel. and
That was
that's
called the
called
ASTP.
Special Training Corps. And at the end of the session, they could see that well, before that, I arrived at Chicago University, and the German classes were full, and what do we do with these that just shipped in? So they put me in a Japanese class, and that was quite an education in itself, because we weren't allowed to speak any English, even to ask for food. And we
Had Japanese instructors.
We had Japanese instructors, and it was very rigid training. And at the end of the session, they saw the possibility of the end of the war coming, and they needed more personnel in the infantry, so they closed the ASTP, Army Specialist Training Programs. And sure enough, they sent us back to infantry units. And I was shipped again back to California and was assigned to the 104th Infantry Division. And there
What camp were you at?
we were in the Mojave
Desert?
Desert. Here we received more military training, and then we were shipped to Colorado Springs, and we all thought we were going to end up in Japan, or Far East. And all of a sudden we were told we were going to the European theater. And so
During this time, I kind of followed him around, and it got to the point, by the time he was in Colorado Springs, we'd said goodbye so many times that it was almost too painful to get together again. I mean, you just wanted to just have it over with. And so that was where we had our last farewell, was Colorado Springs.
you want me to tell any more about
Yes.
the
Then
military?
where did you end up? Where did you go?
We went to the European theater and landed at Cherbourg.
Oh, wow.
And from Cherbourg, we were in combat till the end of the war, and we were stopped before we could go into Berlin. The Russians were supposed to take Berlin, and that was where I was when the war ended.
Who was your
Outside of
commander then at that time?
Hodges was commander of the First Army.
So
I was able to keep track of, because he was with the Timberwolves, and they were quite a well-known fighting unit. Every day I would follow it in the Des Moines Register, and so I just almost was able to pinpoint where he was. And during the Battle of the Bulge, everyone was afraid that he was in the Battle of the Bulge, but I knew that although they were the farthest,
We were on the perimeter
of,
all through the Battle of the Bulge.
but they bypassed his unit because they were a veteran group,
We were given a 12-mile front to hold.
and they went
perimeter of the
around
bulge.
them and
Trying to-
intending to pinch them off behind.
And
They weren't able to do that.
this is where the 106th Infantry was on our right flank, and there was another infantry division on our left, in which your brother was in.
Well, he was
Kenny would know what infantry unit that was.
81st
81st?
sounds correctly.
I think it was 81st. And they overran both of those. And Myron Anderson, who was a friend of mine, a year ahead of me in high school, was in the 106th. And that infantry division had not seen combat. And that division was almost destroyed.
What was your specific job in the infantry?
I had a lot of jobs in the infantry. When I first went in, I was a gunner on a mortar. And then I moved up to a forward observer for the mortars. And forward observers had a tough time. They naturally were looking for forward observers because we were looking for targets. And so we got eliminated quite rapidly there. I was wounded at that time. And then I was burned severely in a fire in one of the buildings.
He actually was alerting his squad that there was a fire, and he put his hands on a door, and the varnish came off on his hands. But in a way, that was a blessing, because then he was sent back to headquarters to help the master sergeant for a while. And eventually that led to your or first sergeant. So that led to a promotion to.
And the first sergeant was older, and he left our unit, and I took over the first sergeant's duties, and they made me a master sergeant then.
You had a really interesting war experience.
And then,
as one of our older Elgin citizens said when I got back and I met him on the street, he said, "Well, you had $1 million experience, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, one I could have done without very easily."
That's a good closing comment.
because he was master sergeant, he was sent back to the United States early then, after the war ended in Germany. And he was sent to California to
San Luis Obispo to open a camp. I was in charge of
and they were going to send them on to Japan.
I was in charge of a company there.
And I had tickets to go, or a ticket to go to San Luis Obispo to say goodbye once more to him. And by that time I was back here in Elgin, and our first son had been born. We lived at my parents' home. And just before I was to fly to go to California, the war ended with the dropping of the atomic bomb. And many young people today wonder at the atrocity of the atomic bomb, but it was the most wonderful day for me because we knew the war was over. And I stood on the front porch of my parents' home, and the whistles were blowing, and the bells were ringing, and Bob was crying, and I was crying.
Very good.
And we feel that Paul said, you know, if they'd gone on to fight, many lives would have been lost on both sides before the close of the war.
It was so close to going. We had one ship already at sea, and we were loading, and the ships turned around. We unloaded, and then soon after that, they started discharging.
You didn't have to go with the occupation force.
I didn't have to go on the occupation forces.
Okay. Is there anything else there, or can we move on? And maybe you could tell a little bit about your church.
Just 1 second. I'd like to add that I was discharged. I had an early discharge because they discharged you according to the number of points you had. And I had a large number of points accumulated for discharge. And I arrived home 3 days after I discharged on a Friday. And I went to Elgin, and Helen was living with her folks. And we just sat down that evening for an evening meal. And the doorbell rang, and it was Walter Fromm, who was president of the school board. And he said, "We need you very badly at school on Monday because we lost 3 teachers tonight, and we don't have a principal. And we know you can fill the job of principal and be a teacher. And so I said, no way. I just got home from overseas and I'm going to spend some time in Elgin, and then I'm going back to Garner because I had a leave of absence. And it all ended with me walking up to school on Monday morning, the following Monday morning, after every school board member had contacted me, I believe. And
That was the beginning of your
career
in Elgin as a teacher.
Then why don't we just continue there? And then you tell about your years in Elgin, and I'd especially talking about your beginning of your career at the Elgin Grade School. And that building is no longer here, so I'd like to have you make comments about your teaching there as briefly as you can.
You want me to go first?
You may.
Well, since Elgin School had been really part of my life, I loved teaching there. I didn't start teaching till our youngest boy, Tom, was in kindergarten. And it was just a wonderful experience because, as I told some of my fellow teachers, they said, you'd come up and work on Sundays afternoon, or aren't you afraid to come up here alone? And I said, oh, I know so much about the Elgin School that even the ghosts are friendly. And I just had a wonderful camaraderie with the other teachers. And I taught for 26 years. And once in a great while, I get letters from some of my former third graders, and it's usually enough to last another 10 years till I get another one. And it was just a wonderful experience for me. I had the same hours as our children, and Paul had the same hours, and he would take me to school in the morning, and I'd listen for the beep at night, about 4:15 or so.
I used to hear that.
And so that's really all I have to say about my teaching.
Paul, do you want to tell a little bit about your principalship and teaching and school board membership?
Well, I started teaching in October of 1945. As I'd mentioned, I wasn't out of the military very long, and I had always said I would never teach in my hometown, but I found it very rewarding, and I found so much cooperation and support from the parents. Many of the parents were former classmates or those that I had grew up with in the communities of Elgin and Claremont. And in those days, you usually graduated from college with a major or two and 3 or 4 teaching minors. And the first several years were quite difficult because I was teaching in 4 different areas besides being principal. And my major was biological science, and I started the biological science class here, and I taught geometry, and I taught algebra, and I taught history, and I
Agriculture.
Pardon?
Agriculture.
Yes, I even taught agriculture 2 years.
I remember that very well.
But I had a minor in agriculture, and so later on, I was asked if I would coach football beginning in the fall of 1941.
No,
and also
not 41.
girls. No, not 41. 49. I'm sorry. And also girls basketball. And these are just added duties to the principalship and the teaching
And
assignments.
you even drove a school bus.
And the last thing I did was add a school bus route to my duties.
You were a jack of all trades.
And it was a very, very busy time until I moved to Valley as principal when the school was reorganized.
Later on, I think after you retired from teaching in principalship, you served on the school board.
I served in the school board for one term against my wishes, but I was more or less pushed into it.
Was that that's kind of hard to get on the other side of the fence, isn't it?
It's very difficult, but I had a very good education there as to what the other side looked like too.
That's right. Helen, do you have anything you want to add about teaching in the old building of Elgin? That you spent your almost a lifetime in that building.
I did. Not really. I would like to say that this was a wonderful place to raise our 3 sons. And since my parents lived across the street, there were 15 of us in this one block area. Now there are just the 2 of us left. But this was a wonderful environment. The children had cousins and aunts and uncles, and how can you go wrong with all that family support? And I can remember Tom saying when he went to Ames for his first year of college that it was terrible to go to a place where nobody cared if you even went to class, when you'd come from a small town where everyone cared about you and loved you. So it was that was really the main reason that we stayed here.
You had 3 boys. Would you like to tell us their names?
Robert, or Bob, teaches now in the Spanish ghetto in Los Angeles. And Jim is the second, James, and he's a minister in Canada near Winnipeg. And Tom, our youngest, is a doctor with the Gunderson Clinic in La Crosse.
You mentioned this family unit, and I wanted you to tell about this, that you had all your families just lived in this one block, plus you had the church just across the street. And would you tell us a little bit about that church?
Well, as I said before, my Jacob Bauman was instrumental in beginning it. It's interesting to note that he and his brother came together, and his brother was helped to start the Apostolic Church. One went one way and one went the other. And my Grandpa Freiberghaus helped to build the building. And I remember that when he told how they had started to excavate for the basement. And someone across the street said, "What are you doing there, Chris?" And he said, "Oh, we're building a hole, or digging a hole to bury the devil." And the church first was a German background. And when I was small, our sermons were in German, and they sang German songs. I don't really remember that too much. But then when World War II came, it wasn't popular to be German, and so that was changed completely to the North American Baptist. We had big family units in our church. I think at one time that all the farms between Elgin and Claremont were owned by Baptist. And
that's correct.
Now we have only probably 1 farmer, maybe 2, left in the church.
When I went to the rural school, we called it the Jacob School at that time.
And where was this?
This was located about 1.5 miles west of the bridge between Claremont and Elgin. It was right near the Alfred Jacob farm.
Oh, near the Alfred Jacob farm.
Right.
Okay, and this was a country school.
And it was all Baptist, wasn't it?
I was going to say that first day I was there, I think there were 14 or 15 of us in the school building, and everyone was attending the Baptist church. Helen had mentioned that the farms were owned by the Baptists between here and Claremont. Also, a few of the farms to the east, like there were the Rucktashels and the Hacks and the Krugers, and we were almost, you could call it a Baptist school. And then I wanted to go back and one little thing that we were talking about, my duties as a principal. And we stopped when I was talking about being on the Board of Education. But I just gotten off the Board of Education, and I was asked to come back and be principal of the junior high, teach and be principal of the junior high. And I served several years there until I retired in 1980.
Why don't you just tell what you've been doing since you retired, you and Helen? And that'll kind of finish up that, and then we'll go back to some other areas that I want especially to hear.
We did a lot of traveling at first. I look at you and Ken and Leo and Carolyn and think that was us about 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Every year we made a project to travel either to Europe. We went to Switzerland 3 times, Helen?
Yes.
Or to Europe, I should say. And we traveled in the States, went to Alaska.
Went to Cancun.
And so
Took a trip east to Washington, D.C., went to Florida, and those were good days. In fact, even when our children were small, when we were teaching, the first thing we would do in the summer was go someplace together. We would take some trip together, and that always was kind of a family tradition.
I know that this year you didn't get to do something that you have done for a number of years. Would you like to comment on
for
that?
17 years. And we spent the winter in Texas. Excuse me.
We went to Rockport, which is just very close to Corpus Christi.
Where my
And those
brother
were wonderful years, and Paul's brother was located just 8 miles from us. He was a permanent resident, so that was an added blessing. And we put down a lot of roots there, made a lot of friends, enjoyed the church there, and those were good years.
I would like to move back in time and have you make a comment about the bakery, Paul, and Helen, about the furniture and funeral home. You did mention why it got started. Paul, do you want to start telling us a little bit about the bakery?
Okay. Well, I said earlier that my father was farming between Claremont and Elgin. And all of a sudden one time, he announced when we were having dinner that he was going to start a bakery in Elgin. Now, this was quite a shock to me anyhow, because I loved the farm, and I never saw him in the kitchen. He left all those duties to my mother, who was a good cook and a good family
Homemaker.
homemaker. And
But he had been trained as a pastry chef and a meat cook in England.
That was his occupation over there. And so I'll never forget the first day I walked into the bakery when he opened the bakery to the public for business. I couldn't believe what I saw, all the pastries and the breads and the rolls and so on.
This was located uptown, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes, I was going to ask whereabouts in Upper Town or Lutra or
Where between the Feller Hardware and the building
Adam Boland's store, wasn't it?
right near there.
Mm-hmm.
But now, what building is there now or isn't there?
There's nothing in the building now. It was a warehouse for Gearing's Hardware.
Okay, that
for
gives
quite a while.
That'll give us a good location.
And they had the bakery below, and they lived above the bakery.
Right. And it was a very good location as far as we were concerned. And my father,
What year was that, Paul?
that would have been fall of 1926.
And how long did you have the bakery? Did your parents have the bakery there?
Well, the bakery, as I was going to say, did very well there. And there was pressure put on my father to move the bakery down to Lower Elgin, because this is where the main grocery stores and the business was carried on. And so we made a move and moved downtown in 1928. I think it was, or 29.
And that was
And
in the building that
Why
where
don't you-
Gene Gus had their
it
business.
was in the building next to the, was it a
Historical
beauty
soc-
shop there?
Oh, so now where the Echo is going to be, where they're moving to,
In that area.
in that
It
area.
was next to the old Rudy Millitaler drugstore.
Okay. And would you give their full names again, so for those who maybe didn't hear it at the beginning of your
Your
parents,
parents.
that did this bakery, just their names?
My father's name was Mattia
Hmm.
Zurbriggen, and my mother's was Margaret.
And they lived a long time, didn't they?
Yes.
They did. And
He actually went on to buy the bakery in Sumner, and that's where they had the Sumner Bakery.
Okay, then, Helen, would you tell us a little bit about the furniture and the funeral home?
Well, my mother helped a lot with the furniture and funeral, both businesses. Actually, they farmed for 3 years, and then her father needed help with the furniture business, and so he took my father in as a partner. And so that was when they moved to Elgin and built the home where the Kleppes now live. My brothers were just 3 years old when they moved to Elgin. And so that was quite a transition for my father, and my mother had lived in that sort of business all her life. So I always said she was kind of the power behind the throne. And in those days when they made calls as morticians, they would have to go often go with my father to the home, and they would do the embalming in the homes. And I've always thought she had a lot of grit and determination to do this kind of thing. And then as the years went by, they didn't do this so much in the homes, and they built the funeral home. But she was always there for visitation, and I always felt that she was a great help to families in times of grief. She had a special touch about her in that respect. And my father was always a well-respected businessman, and he served on the bank board for years. And even though he had only gone to school through the 6th grade, he had a good business head and a lot of common sense, and his word was really well respected in the town.
Let's stop here.
I said that my father began the bakery in Elgin in 1926. And already I was assigned duties, and mostly washing pots and pans and cleaning up the bakery.
I'm glad to this day that he learned to do that, because he can't stand to see a dirty dish in the house.
And then in the summers, Leo Grader, a well-known citizen of Elgin, former citizen of Elgin, worked for my father for 4 summers in the bakery, and I did also. And actually, when I was ready to go to college, I did could do most all the baking if my father was ill, and I did that on many occasions. And I disappointed my father because he tried to persuade me to join him in the bakery and also to become a baker by trade. And then he worked on my younger brother, and when he came home from the service, he did go into the bakery, and he became a baker in Fayette and owned a bakery there. Of course,
All right.
but that was not as appealing to him as he thought, and he left the bakery business.
You like to try different things. All right. Now you'll notice that we have changed our setting because we wanted to share something of the Zurbriggen tradition from Switzerland. And I don't know, Helen, do you want to start?
Well, this is kind of our Swiss corner, and since we made 3 trips back to Switzerland, and at the time Paul had quite a few cousins there, and so that was very, very interesting to meet the cousins, and we became good friends with them.
I had met these cousins when I was a small boy. My mother took me back to Switzerland to see my grandmother on both sides.
And you were only 5 then, weren't you?
Right.
And so, and this was a picture I did of his great-grandfather, who was a famous mountain climber. He, when we went to Macagnaga, Italy, where they lived, we could see why they became mountain climbers, because there was no other way to get out of the village.
The picture that you see on the wall would almost tell that story. And the road stopped at the base of Monte Rosa. And that's the highest peak in Italy and the highest peak in Switzerland.
Were you anywhere near Lugano?
Well, not really.
No.
No. We have been to Lugano, but this is not the same area.
And Helen painted this. Helen really is into art, whether it's needlecraft or paint or sewing, and you did paint this.
Yes, I did. And so we've been proud of our Swiss heritage.
And is there anything, I believe there are still some Zurbriggens who are skiing.
Oh, yes. And last year, actually, they had a big celebration in South America. Argentina, in the Andes, commemorating the fact that Paul's father was the first to climb.
And we received a telephone call from Italy asking
us to come.
To come.
The celebration.
But
a nephew of ours did go, and he climbed part of the way up.
My brother Gordon's son.
Okay. Very interesting. Is there anything else that you would like to share about, I think you took your children to Switzerland too.
Or
Tom.
Tom, and Bob was located in Germany at the time, and so Jim wasn't able to go because he was in college, but we did take Tom.
Okay.
That was our best trip because the family was together then.
And an interesting thing there, when we got ready to come home, the night before, Tom couldn't find his passport, and evidently somebody took it from his back pocket. Helen always had carried it until that last afternoon, and he wanted to cash a check that he had, and she gave him the billfold, and then he stuck it with his discharge papers, and he stuck it back in his back pocket. And so we had to leave him there because he couldn't come home with us without a passport.
He said he grew up a lot in the 3 days it took him to come home.
Yeah, one thing that they've always told us, and I do this, is when you travel overseas, make copies of your MasterCards and your passports. In case they steal your passport, you have a copy.
That's a good idea.
And keep it in a separate place. You have so much wonderful information to give us, and you've had such a full and rich life, it's hard to know where to go next. But I would like to get something about the Lions Club because no one else has talked about that.
The Lions Club was founded in 1948, And I forget how many members we had the first year. Was it 26, Kenneth?
I think it was in the 20s, somewhere there.
And we became very active right away because we were asked by the Board of Education to assist them in raising funds to build an addition to the Elgin school. And after studying it, the Lions decided that it wasn't too good a project because we could have a new school, but where were we going to get the students after a while to fill the school? Because we were being encroached upon in our areas we served by Elkader and by Poseville and by West Union. And we suggested that we try to interest Claremont in a reorganization. And the final reorganization was brought about in 1953. And it was the largest of its kind and the first in the state of Iowa. And we had a much larger tax base and a larger student body, and we could offer many more subjects that we did not have, such as voc ag and chemistry and foreign language and 4 years of shop, and these were just some of the things. But the Lions were very instrumental in the founding of the Valley Reorganization.
And then it wasn't long after that you built the Valley School.
We hadn't really done anything until we decided we have to start a building program. And I think that Harriet probably taught in one of the buildings we brought in from the rural
Country.
schools.
No, they moved him in the year, I taught 2 years, and then I went back to get my degree, and then that's when they moved the schools in. Myrna Moore
Was teaching in one of them. We had 3 rural schools brought in for elementary, and Claremont did the same thing, and the high schools kept their attendance centers.
And
But we were very overcrowded.
And you wrote a thesis for your master's degree on consolidation,
On the reorganization
reorganization.
of the Valley Community School District. Wadena joined the Valley District, that we called it Claremont Elgin at the time, and they expressed a desire to join the Claremont Elgin reorganized district, and in 1957 that became a reality. And, so
Going back to the Lions Club, they had a very good year in 1998. Would you like to tell about some of the events we had during 1998? 50th and
we had our 50th anniversary and celebration in June of 1988. 98, pardon me. And there were only 2 of the charter members, Henry McMillan and myself, in attendance.
They also had a fish fry, which is an annual event. Would you like to
And
tell a little bit about those?
Well, the fish fries became an annual event and a money raiser for the Lions Club. And we had been frying fish for probably 30 years, Kenneth. And we'd always used most of the time we used the Fob Garage as a location. But this year the Fob Garage was not available, and we moved out to the Valley School, and which turned out to be a very satisfactory location.
I think the Lions Club has been very active, and we're, especially when we've had a good restaurant like we have now in the Apple Valley Cafe, and they've done a lot of projects. I was thinking of the tennis court.
The bandstand and the lights in the park.
the lights up at the ball field too.
Football lights.
Football lights, and then the little park uptown. And we've given large amounts to different organizations in the area. Our main project is Sight.
Sight, helping the blind.
Mm-hmm.
You've held glaucoma treatment centers, or
Yes.
I have a few things I want to hit before we run out of tape, so I would like to ask you, why did you want to stay in this area? If you could tell me briefly.
I guess it was mainly family.
Okay.
It was, as I had said before, it was such a wonderful place to raise our
Right.
3 sons.
And I loved the area because I could fish and hunt, and I knew most of the people, and just coming back home again.
I knew you have always been a fisherman, Paul, but I didn't know that you did some hunting too. When, as a youth, what kind of, we'll just go on, what kind of hunting did you do?
Well, I used to go pheasant hunting a lot, and squirrel hunting and rabbit hunting, as most boys did in those days. And
Our sons used to love to go squirrel hunting. Now they aren't interested in it anymore. But they did enjoy that. It was a good family activity.
and after the boys left, I used to take Helen out to the timbers, and she'd chase the squirrels around the other side of the trees so I could get a good shot at them.
You would be interested in knowing that we had 3 pheasants, was it yesterday, Ken?
Mm-hmm.
Right by our barnyard, 3 roosters.
Mm.
We have never seen, we see pheasants on our road, but we have never seen them that close to our buildings before.
They were
I think they
hungry.
were looking for food.
You bet.
And we,
Paul used to enjoy going pheasant hunting, but the last time he went, he almost got shot, and he said it was too much like World War II combat.
no, one thing I want to, some things that stick out in my mind, I would like to have you tell about your Easter tradition of eggs that you had in the newspaper.
That was probably the best tradition that we carried on in our home. My dad would not eat eggs that were colored green and lavender and yellow. They had to be dyed with onion skins. And you just take the brown onion skins and put them in a kettle with some water and put your eggs in, and they get beautiful browns and yellows, and they're very variegated. And my mother would start the egg kettle probably the Thursday before Easter, and many people would use it. And we just pass it around.
It went from her brothers, Clarence and Lawrence's homes, to our home, and then Chuck O'Neill always asked for the kettle.
And my dad, in those days, we weren't concerned about cholesterol, so he'd start having eggs probably on Friday before Easter, and he'd have an egg or 2 with every meal, I think. And he made them, he loved them so much himself that it made it fun for us. And we would crack eggs to find out who had the strongest. And one time my brother Clarence, who was a good wood maker, made a wooden one, and we couldn't figure out why his egg was breaking everyone else's. And to this day, our children, even in La Crosse and from Canada, love to come, and we have an Easter egg. We just have one meal, but we have an Easter egg supper, we call it. And I have fried potatoes, and usually baked beans or scalloped corn, and meatloaf, and then plenty of Easter eggs. And this has been a fun tradition.
Beautiful tradition. Now, could you tell us anything about homecoming?
I guess my biggest memory is that was a time when we gathered together as a family and made the float that would be the float for the Elgin furniture store. And we put a lot of time and effort in it, and they were beautiful floats. And I remember one especially that was shortly after the war, and it was decorated in mostly in white, but with maybe some red and blue with it. And then they had them bring it down by the bandstand, and someone sang "God Bless America," and we thought it was a wonderful float.
When I came here in 1951, I was amazed at the floats. People really spent money and time to make beautiful floats.
Yes.
And you would always, I think you had for many years, one person that led the parade. Am I wrong about
Right.
I think that's
that? The Penny?
Fred Penny.
He was the Indian.
Or tell about that.
Well, Fred Penny, a native of Elgin, always rode a horse, and he was dressed as an Indian, and he would lead the parade. And there were always several bands from visiting communities. And of course, the little Elgin Swiss band was very prominent in the parade. And my father was a director of the Elgin German band, they called it at that time. And the members of that band were Max Hunsberger,
He
Max
played the
Thoma,
tuba.
Gordon Mosby, Cliff Christ, and Ernie Bumgardner. And they had made appearances all over northeast Iowa. They would maybe have 40 to 50 appearances during this year.
And they even played at the
White Sox
Sox
ballpark
ballpark
they
in
were
Chicago.
invited to.
one of the first floats that they had for the furniture store. They used just a truck, and there was a baby bed on the back of it. And I was the child in the baby bed. I suppose I was about 3, and I can remember riding on that float. That was probably the first float they ever had.
In closing,
I'm
excuse
going to interrupt, Helen. You must have been a little older than that.
Maybe 5. I don't know.
The argument is no, of course.
you may discuss that but after we close up
Right.
shop. Now, is there anything, Paul, that you would like to share that, 10 years from now, people will really want to know about? Is there anything you would like to share on your own? And if not, would you go into how has your lifestyle changed? We'll close up with that. Want to think a bit?
Go to her.
Our lifestyle has changed dramatically in the last few years. We live a much quieter lifestyle than we used to. But we've had a good life, and we still enjoy playing 2 games of cribbage each day, one after breakfast and one after our evening meal. And we play a game of dominoes at noon. And we're very, very competitive. And this has been really a good time for us. And we just have had many blessings through the years.
If your mother was to come back today, what things would be an eye-opener for her to see or witness?
I guess the change in our families, the grandchildren that have arrived, and my parents were always if my father saw something new, he had it immediately. When we were in Colorado going to school, he came out and saw the washers and dryers that we had there, and immediately came home and bought a washer and dryer. So I'm sure that if he saw our new appliances, he would have them too.
Even the computer?
I don't know about the computer. My children are trying to get me interested in getting a computer, but that may come.
I think that we have really covered a lot of territory. Paul, you have something?
I was going to say, if they came back and saw the business area today, they wouldn't recognize it. We had 6 grocery stores in Elgin. We had 3 barber shops. We had a wagon maker.
A
We
jewelry
had a
store.
blacksmith. We had a harness maker, craftsman, real craftsman. And We had several restaurants and barber shops, and in all there were probably between 30 and 40 different businesses in the small community. Today that has probably been cut by 2/3. Even the fob garage is no
It's gone.
longer in existence, which we thought never would leave us.
And your furniture store is gone,
Gone.
Gone.
Right,
but you do have funeral home.
right.
And the locker is gone. And,
You,
one thing.
Canning factory.
Pardon?
The canning factory's
Canning
gone.
factory. And the old ice house, we used to have ice delivered in Elgin. And the milk, the dairy that Holzers operated and delivered milk to the homes. These things are far gone.
It seemed like when I was growing up, life was much more laid back and
Very
well,
simple.
yes, and it just seemed like we had lots of time just to be kids, as opposed to today.
And
Well-
we could call the telephone operator over at the store. They would do this and tell them they were going to be at such and such place if somebody was calling for them. Or the doctors would tell where they were going. And Mrs. Grader and Harley Christ and Mrs. Forrest Welch were the main operators, and they kept track of where the emergency calls would be relayed to.
is there anything else that you're thinking of that we've forgotten before we close up?
I think we've covered a lot of
We've covered.
territory.
Well, we really want to thank you because you've lived a lot of years. Thank you very much.
Excuse myself, I'm going to put the coffee pot on. I go sitting up to have a donut.